Professor Daniel Mercer hunched over his desk, squinting at the monitor as the 1890 class photograph from Westmoreland Academy slowly loaded in higher resolution. The St. Louis Historical Society had received the original glass plate negative as part of a donation from a family whose ancestors had attended the prestigious school. As the head of digital restoration at Washington University's History Department, Daniel had been tasked with preserving this piece of local history. "How's it coming along?" Dr. Sarah Chen asked, placing a coffee on his desk. His colleague had been helping catalogue the collection for the past 3 weeks. "Almost there," Daniel replied, adjusting his glasses. "These high-resolution scans take forever, but the detail is incredible." The image finally appeared in full clarity, revealing 47 children and 3 teachers arranged in neat rows on the academy steps. Daniel methodically began checking each face, making notes about clothing styles and postures typical of Victorian-era photography. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, pointing at the screen. "Who's that girl in the back row?" Daniel zoomed in on a solemn-faced girl with dark hair in the top right corner. Unlike the other students who stood firmly on the steps, there appeared to be a gap between her dress and the ground. Her feet were simply missing. "That's odd," Daniel murmured. "Could be damage to the negative." Sarah leaned closer. "Look at the shadows. Everyone else casts one on the steps, but she doesn't." Daniel felt a chill run up his spine. The girl's eyes seemed to stare directly at him across the 135-year gap, her expression unnervingly vacant compared to her classmates. "Let's check the school records," he suggested, trying to sound casual despite his unease. "Maybe we can identify her." After hours of searching through digitized attendance records, they found nothing matching the girl's description. According to the records, Westmoreland's 1890 enrollment showed exactly 46 students, 1 fewer than appeared in the photograph. "This doesn't make sense," Daniel said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Every other student matches the records." That night, as Daniel packed up to leave, he couldn't shake the image of the floating girl from his mind. On impulse, he printed a copy of the photograph and slipped it into his bag. Walking to his car through the empty campus parking lot, he felt an unusual weight to the darkness around him. A gust of wind rustled the autumn leaves, and for a moment he thought he heard the faint sound of a child's laughter carried on the breeze. By the time he reached his apartment in central West End, Daniel had convinced himself he was being ridiculous. Photography from that era was full of anomalies and tricks of light. Tomorrow, with fresh eyes, there would surely be a logical explanation. As he drifted off to sleep, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Found something interesting about Westmoreland. The original building burned down in 1891. Several students didn't make it out." Daniel fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of a dark-haired girl, watching him from the foot of his bed, her feet hovering just above the floor. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the university earlier than usual, the unsettling dreams having left him restless. The department was quiet. Most of his colleagues wouldn't arrive for another hour. He immediately pulled up the digital scan again, zooming in on the mysterious girl. In the harsh morning light, what he saw made his blood run cold. The girl's eyes, which he'd initially thought were simply staring at the camera, were actually looking slightly to the side, directly at the spot where the photographer would have stood. Sarah bustled in with 2 coffees. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she joked, then faltered when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "I need to know more about that fire," Daniel said, taking the coffee gratefully, "and about the students who died." They spent the morning digging through newspaper archives from 1891. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch had covered the Westmoreland Academy fire extensively. It had been one of the worst tragedies in the city's history. The fire had started in the middle of the night, supposedly from a faulty heating system. 17 people had perished, including 12 students. "Here's the list of victims," Sarah said, printing out the yellowed newspaper page. Daniel scanned the names, stopping abruptly at one. Elizabeth Simmons, age 10. "There's a description," he murmured. "Dark-haired daughter of Judge William Simmons." Further research revealed that Judge Simmons had been notorious in St. Louis for his harsh sentencing of minor criminals, particularly immigrants and people of color. He had made many enemies. "Look at this," Sarah said, pulling up another article. There were rumors that the fire wasn't an accident. Some believed it was arson, revenge against the judge through his daughter's school. Daniel felt increasingly uneasy. But that doesn't explain why Elizabeth appears in a photograph taken months before the fire. They continued searching, finding scattered references to Elizabeth throughout the historical record. According to her father's journal, donated to the Historical Society decades later, Elizabeth had claimed to see a dark man watching her in the weeks before the fire. The judge had dismissed it as childish imagination. During lunch, Daniel received an email from Dr. Thornton, the university's photography expert. "Examined your image. No signs of double exposure or manipulation. Whatever you're seeing was present when the photograph was taken." "This is getting weird," Sarah admitted. "Maybe we should step back from this project for a while." But Daniel couldn't let it go. After Sarah left for the day, he continued researching, discovering that the land where Westmoreland Academy had stood remained vacant for nearly 30 years after the fire. Local legends spoke of children's voices heard on the empty lot, particularly around the anniversary of the tragedy. As night fell over the campus, Daniel realized he was the last person in the building. The shadows in his office seemed deeper than usual, the silence more profound. As he gathered his things, his computer screen flickered briefly. When it stabilized, the photograph was open again, zoomed in on Elizabeth's face. He was certain he had closed that file. And now, in the digital image, Elizabeth's head was slightly turned, her eyes no longer looking at the photographer, but directly at him. Daniel barely slept that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Elizabeth Simmons' face, her dark eyes following him. By morning, exhaustion had settled into his bones, but he couldn't stay away from the office, from the photograph. "You look terrible," Sarah commented when he shuffled in. "Have you been sleeping at all?" "I need to go to the site," Daniel said without preamble. "Where Westmoreland Academy stood." Sarah frowned. "That's Lafayette Square, isn't it? There's an office building there now." "Actually, no," Daniel replied, showing her an old map he'd found. The academy was a few blocks east of the square. "It's a small park now. They never rebuilt on the exact spot." An hour later, they stood at the edge of Simmons Memorial Park, a modest green space nestled between Victorian-era houses. Few people knew that the park had been named after Judge Simmons, who had donated the land to the city after the fire, stipulating it should never be developed. The autumn day was bright but cold, dead leaves skittering across the path as they walked through the park. Daniel felt an increasing sense of discomfort, as though they were being watched. "The school would have stood right about here," he said, stopping in a circular clearing. "And according to the floor plans I found, this would have been where the dormitories were located." Sarah hugged herself against the chill. "Daniel, I'm worried about you. You're becoming obsessed with this." "Don't you think it's strange?" he pressed. "The missing feet, her absence from the records, the way her eyes seem to move in the digital file. Photos degrade, records get lost, and digital artifacts happen all the time," Sarah reasoned. "You're seeing connections that aren't there." As they argued, an elderly woman walking her dog approached them. "Are you historians?" she asked, noticing Daniel's university ID badge still hanging from his coat. "Yes, we're researching Westmoreland Academy," Daniel replied. The woman nodded. "My grandmother attended that school, though she transferred out just before the fire. She used to tell stories." She hesitated. "Family legends, really." "What kind of stories?" Daniel asked eagerly. "About a girl who could leave her body at night. The other students feared her, said she would stand at the foot of their beds watching them sleep." The woman smiled apologetically. Childish ghost stories, of course. After the woman left, Sarah looked shaken. That's just a coincidence. But Daniel wasn't listening. He had spotted something on the ground, a small tarnished locket half buried in the dirt. When he picked it up and managed to pry it open, inside was a tiny faded photograph of a solemn-faced girl with dark hair. "We need to leave," Sarah said firmly, but Daniel pocketed the locket. That night, Daniel placed the locket on his bedside table next to the printed photograph of the class. He fell into a troubled sleep, only to jolt awake at 3:17 a.m. The room was ice cold, his breath visible in the darkness. At the foot of his bed stood a small figure, her feet not quite touching the floor. "Elizabeth?" he whispered. The figure didn't speak, but slowly raised her arm, pointing toward his computer. Daniel's hands trembled as he switched on his bedside lamp. The room was empty, but the chill remained, hanging in the air like a physical presence. His laptop, which he'd left on his desk across the room, was open and powered on, its blue light casting eerie shadows. Fighting against every instinct screaming at him to leave the apartment, Daniel approached the computer. On screen was a newspaper article he'd never seen before, dated October 15th, 1890, 5 months before the fire. Judge Simmons sentences arsonist to hanging. The article detailed how Judge William Simmons had sentenced a man named Victor Crane to death for setting fire to a factory, resulting in 3 deaths. Crane had maintained his innocence until the end, reportedly cursing the judge's family as he was led away. "You will know what it is to watch your loved ones burn." Victor Crane was executed on November 1st, 1890. Daniel checked the date of the class photograph, November 2nd, 1890, the day after Crane's execution. His phone rang, startling him so badly he nearly dropped it. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Daniel?" Her voice sounded strained. "Something strange is happening. I was reviewing other photographs from Westmoreland, and I found Elizabeth in 3 more images. In each one, she's standing closer to the camera. And in the last one," she paused, "in the last one, she's standing next to a tall man in dark clothing who isn't in any of the school records." "Crane," Daniel whispered. "What?" "I need to see those photographs, now." Despite the early hour, they met at the university. The campus was deserted, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Sarah had already pulled up the images on her computer. "This is from September 1890, she said, pointing to a group of girls in the academy garden. Elizabeth was barely visible at the edge of the frame. "This one's from October." Now Elizabeth was in the middle of the group, though no one stood near her. "And this one was taken the day before the class photo." In this image, Elizabeth stood at the front, and behind her loomed a tall figure, his face obscured by shadow. "I think I know what's happening," Daniel said slowly. "Elizabeth wasn't just in the photograph. I think she was trying to warn them." Sarah looked skeptical. "Warn them about what?" "About Crane. He blamed her father for his execution. What if he was planning revenge all along?" "Daniel, the man was executed. He couldn't have started the fire." "Not physically, no," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. He turned to the computer and began searching through historical accounts of Victor Crane's trial. Most were straightforward, but one small article from an occult magazine of the era caught his attention. Crane, known among certain circles for his interest in the dark arts, maintained until his execution that he would return to claim his vengeance against those who wronged him. "This is getting ridiculous," Sarah said. "You can't seriously believe—" She was interrupted by a sudden power outage, plunging the office into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the walls. "We should go," Sarah whispered, but Daniel was staring at his phone. The date, November 1st, 2025. Exactly 135 years since Crane's execution. As they gathered their things, Daniel's phone buzzed with a notification. The digital scan of the class photograph had been automatically backed up to his cloud storage with a new file name, warning.jpg. When he opened it, his blood turned to ice. Elizabeth was no longer in the back row. Instead, she stood at the center of the image, her expression one of desperate urgency. Behind her loomed the dark figure from the other photographs. And now, unlike before, they both seemed to be looking directly at Daniel and Sarah. The drive to Daniel's apartment was tense, neither of them speaking much. The streets of St. Louis seemed unnaturally quiet, fog rolling in from the Mississippi River, shrouding the city in a ghostly haze. "You're staying at my place tonight," Daniel insisted, as they climbed the stairs to his third-floor apartment. "I don't think we should be alone." Inside, Daniel immediately went to his computer, pulling up all the images they had of Elizabeth Simmons. When arranged chronologically, a disturbing pattern emerged. In each photograph, Elizabeth appeared more solid, more present, while the dark figure behind her grew more defined. "It's like she's trying to manifest herself," Sarah murmured, her skepticism fading as she studied the progression. "But why now? Why us?" Daniel reached for the locket he'd found in the park. "I think this connected us somehow. And the date? Today is the anniversary of Crane's execution. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the class photograph. And the fire happened exactly 3 months later," Sarah added, checking her notes. "February 2nd, 1891. They spent hours compiling everything they knew, creating a timeline on Daniel's living room wall with sticky notes and string. The pattern became clearer. Elizabeth had been trying to warn people about Crane's vengeful spirit for months before the fire, appearing in photographs, reportedly visiting students in their sleep. "No one believed her," Daniel said grimly. "Just like no one believed Crane when he claimed innocence." Sarah sat heavily on the couch. "So what do we do? Call a priest? Perform an exorcism?" "I think we need to clear Crane's name," Daniel said. "Everything I've found suggests he might have been innocent of the factory fire. Judge Simmons railroaded him through the trial." Sarah checked her watch. 11:48 p.m. "The archives will be closed until Monday. We can't access the original trial records until then." Daniel was about to respond when the lights flickered, then went out completely. His phone died simultaneously. Even the streetlights outside had gone dark. "Sarah," he called, his voice sounding hollow in the darkness. "I'm here," she replied, her voice coming from near the window. "The whole block is out." A sudden crash from the kitchen made them both jump. Daniel fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal broken glass on the floor. The framed class photograph had fallen from where he'd hung it on the wall, and in the beam of the flashlight they saw small, wet footprints leading from the kitchen into the hallway. "Those look like a child's footprints," Sarah whispered. The footprints led to Daniel's bedroom door, which was now closed, though he was certain it had been open earlier. As they approached, the temperature dropped dramatically, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Daniel reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking. The metal was ice-cold against his palm as he slowly pushed the door open. Standing in the center of his bedroom was Elizabeth Simmons, no longer the translucent figure from their visions, but solid, her dark eyes wide with urgency. Behind her loomed a tall shadow, its features indistinct, except for burning eyes that seemed to bore into Daniel's soul. "He's coming back," Elizabeth said, her voice like distant bells, "just like before. You have to stop it." Before Daniel could respond, both figures vanished, leaving only a lingering chill and the faint smell of smoke in the air. The power returned just before dawn, along with cell service. Daniel and Sarah had spent the night huddled in the living room, too terrified to sleep. As first light crept through the windows, they made a decision. They needed to access the courthouse archives today, permission or not. "I know the weekend security guard at the Hall of Records," Daniel said, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "He owes me a favor." 2 hours later, they were being escorted through the basement archives of the St. Louis County Courthouse by a heavy-set security guard named Ray. "You've got 1 hour," Ray warned, unlocking the secure room containing records from the 1890s. "And you didn't get in here through me," The room was dusty and cramped, with row upon row of filing cabinets and shelves stacked with boxes. Many of these documents hadn't been digitized yet, existing only in their original fragile form. "We need to find anything related to Victor Crane's trial," Daniel said, scanning the organization system, February through October 1890. They worked methodically, pulling files and carefully examining yellowed papers, many brittle with age. After 40 minutes of searching, Sarah found what they were looking for, a transcript of Crane's trial, along with evidence logs and witness statements. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a statement from the factory's night watchman. He initially claimed he saw a tall man with a limp near the factory before the fire, but in his court testimony, he specifically identified Crane. Daniel found another document, a medical report on Crane after his arrest. It says here Crane had no physical disabilities, certainly no limp. They continued digging, finding more inconsistencies. The prosecution's star witness had changed key details between his initial police statement and court testimony. Most damning of all, they discovered a buried police report suggesting the factory owner had recently increased his insurance policy and was in severe financial trouble. "Crane was framed," Daniel muttered. "The owner probably started the fire himself for the insurance money." "And Judge Simmons rushed the trial," Sarah added, reading from court minutes. "He denied the defense multiple requests for more time to gather evidence." As they pieced together the truth, the temperature in the archive room began to drop. Their breath became visible in the increasingly frigid air. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered. A low creaking sound came from the far corner of the room, like old floorboards groaning under weight. Daniel directed his phone's flashlight toward the noise, revealing nothing but shadows. "We need to go," he said, gathering the most important documents. "I think we've found what we need." As they hurried toward the exit, the lights flickered, then went out completely. In the beam of Daniel's flashlight, they saw a figure standing by the door, the tall, dark silhouette they had glimpsed in Daniel's apartment. "Victor Crane!" Daniel called, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to distort, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Sarah clutched Daniel's arm. "What does he want?" "Justice," Daniel replied. "That's what Elizabeth was trying to tell us." Summoning his courage, Daniel stepped forward. "We know the truth. You were innocent. Judge Simmons was wrong." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure dissipated, seeming to dissolve into the darkness. The lights flickered back on, and the room returned to its normal temperature. "Did we exorcise him?" Sarah asked uncertainly. "I don't think so," Daniel replied. "I think we just bought ourselves some time." As they left the archives, Daniel's phone buzzed with a notification. The digital photograph had changed again. Now Elizabeth stood alone, the dark figure no longer visible behind her, but her expression was still one of desperate warning. "It's not over," Daniel murmured. "There's more to this story." After leaving the courthouse, Daniel and Sarah spent the afternoon at a coffee shop, combing through public records databases. If they couldn't put Crane's spirit to rest by clearing his name through historical documents alone, perhaps his descendants could help. "Crane had a younger brother who moved to Chicago after the execution," Sarah said, scrolling through census records. "The family line continues from there." After hours of searching, they found what they were looking for. Victor Crane's great-great-grandson, Michael Crane, lived just outside St. Louis in Webster Groves. "We can't just show up at his house claiming his ancestor is haunting us," Sarah pointed out reasonably. "No," Daniel agreed. "But we can tell him we're historians who've uncovered evidence his ancestor was wrongfully executed. That's actually true." They called ahead, and to their surprise, Michael Crane agreed to meet them that evening. His interest was piqued by the mention of historical evidence about his family. Michael's home was a modest craftsman-style house on a quiet street lined with oak trees. He was a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair, and the same sharp features visible in Victor Crane's mugshot from 1890. My family doesn't talk much about Victor, Michael said as he led them into his study. It's been a dark cloud hanging over the Crane name for generations. Daniel carefully laid out the evidence they'd discovered. The contradictory witness statements, the rushed trial, Judge Simmons' reputation for harsh sentences. Michael listened intently, occasionally nodding. This confirms what my grandfather suspected. He spent years trying to clear Victor's name, but the records were sealed back then. There's something else, Daniel said hesitantly, something we haven't mentioned yet. He showed Michael the photograph of Elizabeth Simmons and explained the strange occurrences they'd experienced. Rather than dismissing them as crazy, Michael walked to a bookshelf and pulled out an old leather-bound volume. This was Victor's journal, he said. It was returned to the family after his execution. Most of it is mundane, but there are passages. He opened to a marked page and read, "I have learned to project my spirit beyond my body. In dreams, I can travel where my physical form cannot. If they take my life, this knowledge will be my vengeance." A chill ran through the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. "There's more," Michael continued. "Family legend says Victor was studying the occult before his arrest. Not for evil purposes, but seeking knowledge. He believed the spiritual and physical worlds were connected in ways science couldn't explain. And Judge Simmons took that interest in the occult as evidence of his guilt," Sarah surmised. Michael nodded. "Precisely. In those days, any hint of the supernatural was seen as proof of moral corruption." As they talked, Daniel noticed a small portrait on Michael's wall, a dark-haired young woman in Victorian dress. "Who is that?" he asked, his pulse quickening. "My great-grandmother, Catherine," Michael replied. "She was engaged to marry Victor before his arrest. After his execution, she married his brother instead." Daniel approached the portrait, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. The woman's features were hauntingly familiar, the same solemn expression, the same dark eyes. "Catherine had a younger sister, didn't she?" Daniel asked quietly. "A half-sister, perhaps?" Michael looked surprised. "Yes, Elizabeth. She died young in a school fire. How did you know?" The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Elizabeth wasn't trying to warn her classmates about Crane. She was trying to warn them about her father. Judge Simmons had executed an innocent man, a man who had mastered astral projection. Crane's spirit had indeed returned for revenge, using the fire to punish the judge through his daughter. But Elizabeth had somehow sensed the danger, perhaps sharing some of the same sensitivity to the spiritual world that Crane possessed. She had tried to warn people through the only means available to her, appearing in photographs, visiting students in their dreams, and now, 135 years later, something was happening again. "Michael," Daniel said urgently, "do you know if any of Judge Simmons' descendants still live in St. Louis?" Michael's fingers flew across his keyboard as he searched through genealogical databases. "Simmons is a common name, but if we trace Judge William Simmons' specific line," his voice trailed off as he stared at the screen, "there's one direct descendant still in St. Louis. A woman named Sarah Chen," Sarah interrupted, her face pale. "My grandmother's maiden name was Simmons. William Simmons was my great-great-grandfather." Daniel stared at her in shock. "You never mentioned I didn't know the connection until now," she said defensively. "My grandmother rarely spoke about her family history. She changed her name when she married my grandfather." And the room seemed to grow colder. On Michael's computer screen, the family tree displayed an unbroken line from Judge William Simmons to Sarah Chen. "That's why Elizabeth has been appearing to us," Daniel realized. "She's trying to warn you." "But warn me about what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "The fire happened 135 years ago." Michael was scrolling through news articles on his phone. "There's a retrospective exhibition opening tomorrow at the St. Louis Historical Museum. Justice in the Gilded Age, the legacy of Judge William Simmons." "Tomorrow is November 3rd, Daniel said. the day after the class photograph was taken in 1890. And 3 months before the fire, Sarah added, a note of fear creeping into her voice. They drove back to the city in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. At Sarah's apartment, Daniel helped her pack an overnight bag. They had agreed she shouldn't stay alone. As Sarah gathered her things, Daniel noticed a framed photograph on her bedside table, Sarah as a child, standing with an elderly woman. "Is that your grandmother?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "The last of the Simmons line before me." Daniel studied the photograph, then froze. In the background, barely visible in the shadowy corner of the room, was a small, dark-haired girl. "Sarah," he said quietly, "Elizabeth has been watching over your family for generations." Back at Daniel's apartment, they laid out everything they knew on his living room wall. Photographs, documents, timelines. The pattern was clear now. Elizabeth had been trying to prevent a cycle of vengeance that had begun with her father's unjust sentencing of Victor Crane. Crane's spirit caused the fire that killed Elizabeth and the others, Daniel theorized. But that only continued the cycle of injustice. "And now history is trying to repeat itself," Sarah said, looking at the announcement for the museum exhibition honoring her ancestor. "They're celebrating a man who sent an innocent person to death." Daniel's phone buzzed with a notification. The class photograph had changed again. Now Elizabeth stood alone in the frame, the other students and teachers completely gone. She was pointing urgently at something off-camera. "We need to stop the exhibition," Daniel said. "That's what she's trying to tell us." Sarah made several calls, but the museum director was unwilling to postpone the opening. "It's too late," she reported. "Everything is set up. The mayor will be there for the ribbon cutting at noon." As night fell, a storm moved in over St. Louis, lightning illuminating the skyline in stark flashes. Daniel stood at his window, watching the approaching tempest. The historical museum was just visible in the distance, spotlights illuminating its classical facade despite the weather. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, joining him at the window. "Elizabeth isn't just warning us about the exhibition. I think she's offering us a chance to break the cycle." "How?" "By acknowledging the truth. By making sure Victor Crane's innocence is recognized at the same time my ancestor's legacy is being celebrated." Daniel nodded slowly. A public reckoning. Thunder rumbled overhead as they formulated their plan. They would attend the exhibition opening and present their evidence. The trial discrepancies, Crane's journal, the historical record showing Judge Simmons's bias. As they finally prepared for bed, exhaustion overtaking their fear, Daniel checked the class photograph one last time. It had changed again. Now Elizabeth was smiling, a small, hopeful expression that somehow conveyed more emotion than any of her previous solemn appearances. Behind her, the dark figure of Victor Crane remained absent, but the background had changed. Instead of the academy steps, Elizabeth now stood in what appeared to be the main hall of the St. Louis Historical Museum. "She'll be there tomorrow," Daniel murmured, "watching us." That night, for the first time since discovering the photograph, Daniel slept without dreaming of Elizabeth Simmons. Instead, he dreamed of justice long delayed, finally being served. The St. Louis Historical Museum was crowded despite the continuing storm. Local dignitaries, historians, and members of prominent St. Louis families had gathered for the opening of Justice in the Gilded Age, an exhibition celebrating Judge William Simmons and other influential legal figures from the city's past. Daniel and Sarah arrived early, carrying a folder of documents and Michael Crane's permission to tell his ancestors' story. They had spent the morning preparing a presentation of their evidence, hoping to convince the museum director to include Victor Crane's case in the exhibition. "Are you ready for this?" Daniel asked as they climbed the museum steps, rain beating down on their shared umbrella. Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. "My family has lived with this unacknowledged guilt for generations. It's time for the truth. Inside, The museum's grand hall had been transformed. Display cases lined the walls, containing artifacts from Judge Simmons's career, his gavel, legal texts, personal correspondence. At the center of the hall stood a large portrait of the judge, his stern countenance looking down on the gathering crowd. Sarah approached the museum director, Dr. Eleanor West, a formidable woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes. "Dr. West, we need to speak with you about an urgent matter concerning Judge Simmons," Sarah began. "Ms. Chen, isn't it?" Dr. West replied coolly. "Your family declined to loan us any personal artifacts for the exhibition. A bit late to change your mind now." "This isn't about artifacts," Daniel interjected. "It's about historical accuracy. We've uncovered evidence that one of Judge Simmons' most famous cases resulted in the wrongful execution of an innocent man." Dr. West's expression hardened. "Young man, Judge Simmons' record has been extensively researched by scholars far more experienced than yourself. This exhibition has been planned for months. I'm not about to make last-minute changes based on what exactly? Ghost stories." Before Daniel could respond, the lights flickered, briefly plunging the hall into darkness. When they came back on, several guests gasped. The temperature in the room had dropped precipitously, their breath now visible in the cold air. "Just a power surge from the storm, Doctor," West said dismissively, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. As the opening ceremony began, Daniel and Sarah took seats near the back of the hall. The mayor approached the podium to give his opening remarks, praising Judge Simmons as a pillar of justice in a time of corruption. The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they stabilized, Daniel noticed something strange about the judge's portrait. Where before Simmons had been depicted alone, now a small figure appeared to be standing in the background, a dark-haired girl in a Victorian dress. Sarah clutched his arm. "Do you see that?" Before he could answer, the portrait began to drip water as though it were crying. Droplets ran down the canvas, pooling on the floor beneath. Murmurs of confusion spread through the crowd. Dr. West hurried to examine the portrait, touching the wet canvas with trembling fingers. "It's coming from inside the painting," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The mayor attempted to continue his speech, but was interrupted by a loud crack of thunder directly overhead. The lights went out completely, emergency illumination casting eerie shadows across the hall. In the semi-darkness, Daniel stood up. "I think we all need to acknowledge what's happening here," he called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "This exhibition is built on a lie. Judge William Simmons was not the paragon of justice you believe him to be." "Young man, this is hardly the time," the mayor began, but fell silent as the temperature dropped even further, frost beginning to form on the windows despite the autumn weather outside. Daniel stepped forward, pulling out the documents they had gathered. In 1890, Judge Simmons sentenced a man named Victor Crane to death for arson. "We have evidence proving Crane was innocent, framed by the factory owner for insurance money." Sarah joined him, her voice steady despite her fear. "William Simmons was my ancestor. I've come to set the record straight. He rushed the trial, ignored contradictory evidence, and sent an innocent man to the gallows." As she spoke, the emergency lights began to brighten, the unnatural cold slowly receding. 3 months after Crane's execution, a fire destroyed Westmoreland Academy, killing Judge Simmons' daughter Elizabeth and 11 other children. For 135 years, this cycle of injustice and vengeance has continued unacknowledged. Dr. West had gone pale, staring at the portrait, which now clearly showed Elizabeth Simmons standing behind her father, her hand on his shoulder. "The Historical Society recently discovered a class photograph from Westmoreland Academy," Daniel continued, pulling out a printed copy. "Taken the day after Crane's execution, it shows Elizabeth Simmons trying to warn her classmates about the coming tragedy." As Daniel held up the photograph, gasps rippled through the crowd. The image had changed again. Now it showed Elizabeth standing alone on the academy steps, smiling gently, her feet firmly on the ground for the first time. For generations, Elizabeth's spirit has been trying to break this cycle, Sarah continued, her voice stronger now, not seeking vengeance, but justice. She wanted the truth to be known. The museum director approached slowly, examining the photograph with wide eyes. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "The composition is changing before our eyes." The mayor cleared his throat. "What exactly are you suggesting we do?" "Acknowledge the truth," Daniel said simply. "Include Victor Crane's story in this exhibition. Recognize that Judge Simmons, for all his accomplishments, was fallible, that he made at least one terrible miscarriage of justice that led to tragedy. A tall man stepped forward from the crowd, Michael Crane, who had decided to attend after all. "My family has carried this burden for generations," he said. "Victor Crane was not a murderer. He was a scholar, interested in spiritual matters that were misunderstood in his time." The storm outside seemed to intensify, rain lashing against the windows as the group stood in tense silence. Finally, Dr. West nodded. "History isn't served by perpetuating myths," she conceded. "We'll create a new section on controversial verdicts, featuring the Crane case prominently." She turned to the mayor. "With your permission, of course." The mayor, looking shaken by the unexplainable events, nodded his agreement. As arrangements were made, Daniel noticed a small figure standing near the museum entrance, a dark-haired girl in a Victorian dress, visible for just a moment before she faded from view. This time, he wasn't afraid. Elizabeth had accomplished what she'd been trying to do for over a century. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the renovated exhibition hall, now featuring a prominent display on Justice Reconsidered, the case of Victor Crane. The museum had incorporated all their research, including court transcripts, witness statements, and a reproduction of Crane's journal. Most powerfully, they had included the class photograph, restored to its original state with all 47 students visible, though Elizabeth Simmons now stood with her feet firmly on the ground, no longer the floating apparition that had first caught Daniel's attention. "It's perfect," Sarah said, joining him. Their relationship had deepened through their shared ordeal, drawing them together in unexpected ways. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Daniel asked. Sarah considered this. "I think she's finally been heard. That's what she wanted all along." The exhibition had attracted national attention, with historians and paranormal researchers alike fascinated by the story. Daniel and Sarah had published their findings in an academic journal, carefully omitting the supernatural aspects while focusing on the historical miscarriage of justice. As they walked through the museum, Daniel felt a sense of completion. The Westmoreland Academy fire was now properly contextualized as a tragedy born from injustice, not just a random accident. Judge Simmons's legacy had been complicated but not destroyed, human rather than heroic. "There's something I haven't told you," Sarah said, as they paused before a new addition to the exhibition, a memorial plaque listing all those who had died in the Westmoreland fire. "I've been having dreams about Elizabeth." "What kind of dreams?" Daniel asked, tensing slightly. "Good ones," Sarah assured him. "She's always smiling, playing with the other children. Sometimes she looks at me and says, 'Thank you.' I think she's happy now." Outside, snow was falling gently over St. Louis, the winter sun casting long shadows across the museum steps. As they left the building, Daniel thought he glimpsed 2 figures in the distance, a small, dark-haired girl holding hands with a tall man, both of them fading into the swirling snow. "Some historians say we study the past to avoid repeating it," Daniel said quietly. "But sometimes we study it to heal it." Sarah slipped her hand into his. "I think we've done both." That night, Daniel opened his laptop to review the digital scan of the class photograph one last time. The image had stabilized, all 47 students and 3 teachers arranged on the academy steps, including Elizabeth Simmons standing firmly in the back row. But as he was about to close the file, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the window of the academy building behind the group, a faint reflection was visible, a tall man and a small girl watching over the students, not in malice, but in protection. Daniel smiled and closed the file. Some spirits, he had learned, remained not to haunt but to heal, not to frighten but to guide. Elizabeth and Victor had been linked by tragedy, but in the end they had found a kind of peace together, their long vigil finally complete. In the St. Louis Historical Society archives, the original glass plate negative of the Westmoreland Academy class photograph rested in acid-free storage, carefully preserved. To most observers, it showed nothing unusual, just a group of Victorian-era schoolchildren frozen in time. But those who knew what to look for might notice how one dark-haired girl in the back row seemed to be standing just a little more firmly than the others. Her feet planted solidly on the academy steps, her solemn face bearing the faintest hint of a smile. And in the years that followed, visitors to Simmons Memorial Park sometimes reported seeing a dark-haired girl playing among the trees, laughing as she hadn't been able to in life, her feet leaving perfect prints in the fresh snow before fading away like footsteps from another time, finally at peace.